Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming into my show today. I promised you a live stream tonight. I didn't say what time, so at whatever time you're seeing this is the time I promised you I'd be on. There is a Schiller Institute event happening this Saturday. That's 2 days from now. People can look on the screen and see it right there. The world needs JFK's vision of peace, and it's happening at 10 a.m. Eastern Time this Saturday. And you may have seen me make a big deal about this speech. I just interviewed Oliver Stone on this speech. And why? Why exactly is this speech such a big deal? I brought on Dennis Speed from the Schiller Institute to actually talk about that speech, and he's going to give us a little bit of a presentation. So, Dennis, why should people actually care about this speech?
Well, first of all, Jose, thanks for having me on. Very much appreciate this. This is a speech that was given 60 years ago this Saturday. It was given by John Kennedy, and it was done at the commencement exercise of at American University. In the speech, what he says has not been said in any form by any American president for 4 decades. But what's important about what he says is that it is completely the opposite of what our present policy is with respect to both Russia and also with respect to other nations as well on the questions of war and peace. It is startlingly different. In fact, were Kennedy to attempt to give this speech today, he would be being called by Secretary Blinken and others anti-American. I think probably it's best for people to get a flavor of the speech. And so what we've done is prepare a 4-minute excerpt out of what is a 26-minute speech. People can go online and, of course, see the entire speech. But just to get the flavor of how absolutely different it is compared to anything that you've seen from any recent American president, going back arguably really to Kennedy himself, I think we should give people a taste of it.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity, But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Wow. It's a great speech.
And the point is that that kind of sentiment rises far above the kind of pedestrian, banal, small-minded speech that we get from the White House or from any European head of state these days. It's important to recognize that if you don't have great statesmen, it's not possible to achieve great things. People often talked about Kennedy as being a great speech maker, but he didn't get much done. But in fact, the space program on the one hand, and the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis on the other, both occurred on his watch. The day after he gave that speech, by the way, he gave the 1963 Civil Rights speech, what Oliver Stone calls one of the first eloquent statements on civil rights given by an American president. And certainly after Lincoln, which was about 100 years earlier, it would be probably the only major eloquent statement given. There were statements that Ulysses Grant and others may have made, but what's important is to understand that this was a back-to-back thing, that within 24 hours, two different earth-shattering changes were being made in American policy. And that was the rate at which change was happening in that United States. Now we have a crumbling United States. We have a United States which is afraid of its own shadow, a United States which is willing to talk about spreading democracy and stopping Russia from occupying Ukraine while the United States occupies 1/3 of Syria. And it's been in that country for over a decade. Nobody even talks about it, can't even raise it. So the hypocrisy and the venality and the corruption and the duplicity that now characterizes the nation must be addressed by the citizens, but also in the era where you have so much money in politics, the voice of the citizen cannot be heard. There are over 130 or 150 million people in this country whose voices are never heard. Those are the voices of the poor. Sometimes they're called the working poor. Sometimes they're called the working class, but they're never heard in any way, except perhaps as some sort of pastime or entertainment. They don't vote. They're not involved in the process. And that itself, that level of injustice is not only allowed in the United States, it's actually celebrated. When you don't have a presidency and you don't have people associated with the presidential system that are regular citizens, that are out organizing in the population to force the presidency to stand up against injustice, then you risk a situation in which the world itself goes out of control, not because the United States should be running the world, but because the United States is running headlong into disaster, and the overarching power of the United States will cause the whole world to tip in that direction. We're in that circumstance, and so the idea of the speech and commemorating the speech is to not have some sort of celebration like a commemoration, but a mobilization of this population to do what it once did before. I'm not hearing you.
Sorry, I was muted. I was just saying, I think that blows away and blows out of the water a lot of discourse today where you have a lot of talking heads. I mean, this format that you and I are doing has been popularized because a lot of people talk about events as if they're spectators in a sport, right? Oh, this certain candidate said this, or I'm not voting Democrat anymore, or I can't support this person because they're running with that person. But it's never really about, well, what are you prepared to do? What are you about to do? And I really appreciate not only hearing what Kennedy has to say, because I think it can motivate all of us as to what exactly any ordinary American citizen can be doing, which is just sharing the speech and echoing the speech out to whoever their followers are, whether you have 5 followers or 5,000 followers. I think getting this speech is an act of revolution right now because you don't have this kind of discourse. So yeah.
That's true. And I think also there's another element here. I don't really care what people think about Kennedy. You're living in a time now. Marshall McLuhan was an old 1960s intellectual Canadian, actually, in by extraction. And he wrote a book, several books, but he wrote a book called The Medium is the Massage, not message. He did also say the medium is the message. But what he was trying to say is that when you use a cell phone, or you use a computer, or you're watching television, or you're listening to the radio, the media you are using operate on you. He was saying they are not passive. The fact that you tap on a keyboard or you switch it back in the old, you use your remote, on the television, or in the old days, you switched on the radio. That didn't mean that you were the major actor. The actor was the medium through which your reality was being conveyed to you. And what he talked about was the problem of the global village in the era of electronic communications. He said what happens with electronic communications is that space and time were completely changed in the lives of those that were inundated with or lived within the sea, the ocean of electronic media. So that everything is simultaneous. And we all live in a kind of a global village. He said, but global because all of the barriers are down. You can literally intrude into a party in Zimbabwe at 4 a.m. their time, from 9 p.m. here, just by getting on a Zoom call. And people from Sri Lanka can be watching what you're doing, or in some chat room that you're doing. So that although there's differences in ethnicity, culture, language, background, history, these get obliterated. Why is this significant? If you look at us today, and he says this, global village doesn't mean that people are brought together for a good purpose. It doesn't mean harmony. It just means that everybody knows everybody else's business, like a gigantic gossip column. And that you have to have principles. You got to have people in the global village that are mobilizing people to be better than they are, or for a higher purpose than whatever they may be caught in. On the one hand, you can use that situation to change the environment, to develop things, to transform things. Look at what Kennedy is saying to his arch enemy, the Soviet Union, which he had just threatened to blow off the face of the earth in October of 1962. He and Nikita Khrushchev on the other side were the two men that at that time had the power, and they knew it, to push buttons and get rid of the entire human race, whether that was by miscalculation or by intention. And he decided at that point, this is unspeakable. The fact that we have this power is itself a crime. Now, what we have to do is we have to pull back from that, and we have to change ourselves. And the only way we can do that is that I've got to look at reality from the way you see it. And you've got to look at reality from the way I see it. Because that way we might be able to see reality, not because yours is reality or mine is reality, but yours is so different from mine that now I've got to realize there's a different way to see things all together. There's a whole other way of seeing, a whole other way of visualizing things. And that's our problem today. You got to have a vision for the future. And so the idea that the human race is to blame for everything, no, the human race is the only way that you're going to change everything. So people who've been born into cultures where they're being told your carbon footprint is too big, there are too many people, your jobs are obsolete, your culture is the wrong one for this time, you live in the past. Well, then of course you get serial killers and you get mass shootings, you get people hanging themselves and mass suicides and all sorts of things. But that wasn't Kennedy's world. He said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Now, right now, tonight, what people can do for their country is circulate that speech or that excerpt of that speech that we just played. And I want to put one other one right now to just give people a sense of how rapidly Kennedy changed. Now, this speech is given in June 10th. We're going to play a short excerpt from another speech given in September. Now, remember, in October of 1962, we threatened to blow the Soviet Union off the face of the earth, and they threatened to blow the United States off the face of the earth. It was, in one sense, an even worse situation than we have right now. Some might argue that that's not true, that the situation right now is worse. But here's what happened at the United Nations in September, I think on September 20th, I believe. It might have been 20, yeah, of 1963. We're going to play you just a short excerpt of what he had to say on that occasion.
Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. Space offers no problems of sovereignty. By resolution of this assembly, the members of the United Nations have forsworn any claim to territorial rights in outer space or on celestial bodies, and declared that international law and the United Nations Charter will apply. Why, therefore, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure? Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space, sending someday in this decade to the moon, not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all of our countries.
So what Kennedy actually proposed was not an American mission to the moon, but a human mission to the moon jointly with the Soviet Union. I'm sure that virtually nobody listening ever even heard of that. But he did that in 1963 in September 20th. That's 2 months before he was killed. And the next time any kind of vision like that would be offered to the Soviet Union from the United States was on March 23rd, 1983, when President Ronald Reagan had a proposal, which was, by the way, authored by Lyndon LaRouche, an economist and statesman with whom I worked very closely, well, from 1972. And he proposed the idea that instead of nuclear weapons, what needed to happen is to have a different kind of weapon that would make nuclear weapons obsolete, a defensive weapon. And this was the thing that got later called Star Wars, but it was beam weapons technology, laser-based technologies that would be able to melt the guidance mechanisms of rockets or would otherwise cause them to be deflected and therefore be unreliable in their trajectory. Beam of light always moves faster than anything else. And therefore, it meant that if you put systems in space, laser-based weapon systems in space, that you would in that way render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. And now this was something that was proposed back in 1983. The Soviets were actually slightly ahead of the United States in certain of the technologies, but they were behind in the ability to execute certain things on miniaturization, computerization, some things that the United States had as advantage. And that proposal was made in 1983, but neither of those proposals was implemented due to the opposition of the war party, of the people with the $1 trillion military budget. And those are the people that, in part, in my view, were part of the atmosphere, if not the actual execution of John F. Kennedy in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, not Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah, Dennis, you can't hear me, right? Yes, you can.
Yes.
You're bringing up something that you can see the difference between like Kennedy 1962 and Kennedy 1963, because the UN speech that you just played does not sound like the Kennedy that was ready to go against the Soviet Union, and it doesn't even sound like, from my impression, what a lot of people during the Cold War had an attitude towards to the Soviet Union. And so today it seems like common sense, or I guess if this was 5 years ago before the Ukrainian war, this would seem like common sense to work with many other nations. But what I grew up learning in school was that many things were about trying to beat the Soviets, whether it was the quote space race, arms race, right? Everything was in competition. But what you just showed directly contradicts that. Why is that?
Well, we might actually show that discussion, and I'll say something about what this is. It's because people change. See, great leadership is not about being necessarily about being great when you come into office. It's what happens as you are transformed in that office. For example, that's my argument when people bring up Abraham Lincoln to me and say, well, Abraham Lincoln was no great friend of Black people. Well, Abraham Lincoln had one clear commitment, which he made clear from early on in his life. He believed that there should be economic development in the United States independent of slavery. And he believed that because he recognized that slavery ultimately doesn't just, quote, lose money, but that degrading anyone as a slave destroys the very fabric and premise of the actual government of the Constitution of the United States. People say, oh, yeah, well, the United States was based on slavery. Well, actually, the United States would never have worked if it was based on slavery. The United States was based on a revolution against a form of slavery, which was visited upon the colonists as a whole. And then because of the inability to get South Carolina, also Georgia to some degree by that time, and other parts of the South, to go along with putting in the clauses in the Declaration against slavery. There were clauses written against slavery, which Jefferson had drafted on behalf of the committee, but they were not put in the final document. There was an argument at the Constitutional Convention, which came from New York, from Gouverneur Morris of New York, against slavery. But that was also voted out. And what we had was the preamble to the Constitution, the general welfare. Abraham Lincoln's approach, like that of Kennedy's, started in a certain location. He believed, for example, Lincoln believed in the idea of Black people leaving America and going either to Panama or Colombia or back to Africa. But when he met with various African-American clergy and other representatives, and they adamantly refused to go along with that, he was shocked because he said, I wouldn't want to stay in a country where people had treated me the way you were treated. But then it was Frederick Douglass that changed Lincoln's view, and that's why you had 190,000 African-American soldiers as of after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, recruited to the Union Army. That's what was the turning point in manpower that was provided for the creation of the United States. And for everybody that wants to talk all that stuff about John Brown had how many people with him when he did the raid, which was doomed to failure compared to the 190,000 that Frederick Douglass got. Frederick Douglass refused to go with John Brown on that raid because Frederick Douglass realized, no, I'm not going to take 15 guys and go down and try to shoot up some place in Virginia. What I'm going to do is try to see if I can get an entire country worth of people, and we're going to get freedom for everybody, including poor white people. See, so there was a difference in these people, and Lincoln grew into that. And the same is true of Kennedy. But the process has not ever been revealed to the American people, even though it's there, you can find it. If you want to show a contrast, this is up to you. You can show we have a video of Kennedy having this discussion about the space program right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's very clear that he says there the exact opposite of what people just heard. But so he changed his view, and maybe at some point that be a useful thing to see. But I think if you want to do something that might be even better for us, given what's gone on with Ukraine, let's let people see Kennedy making a private memo, November 4th, 1963. This is 18 days before he's killed. And he's talking about a coup in Vietnam against the Diem government that he had in fact authorized, that killed that head of state, executed him. And he's talking about the way in which the mistake was made. Let's just play it because his words make it clearer than anything I can say. What kind of circumstances he found himself in as late as November 1963.
All right, let's go to that.
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of conversation about a coup, conversation which divided the government here and in Saigon. Opposed to a coup was General Taylor, the Attorney General, Secretary McNamara, to a somewhat less degree, John McCone, partly because of an old hostility to Lodge, which causes him to lack confidence in Lodge's judgment, partly as a result of a new hostility, because Lodge shifted his station chief, semicolon, in favor of the coup was State, led by Abel Harriman, George Ball, Roger Hilsman, supported by Mike Forrestal at the White House. I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August, in which we suggested the coup. Period, in my judgment, that wire was badly drafted. It should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views. While we did redress that balance in later wires, that first wire encouraged Lodge along a course to which he was, in any case, inclined. Hawkins continued to oppose the coup on the ground that the military effort was doing well. There was a sharp split between Saigon and the rest of the country. Politically, the situation was deteriorating. Militarily, it had not had its effect. There was a feeling, however, that it would. For this reason, Secretary McNamara and General Taylor supported applying additional pressures to Diem and New in order to move them.
Hello. Naughty, naughty.
Why do the leaves fall? And why does the snow come on the ground?
Because
Why do the leaves turn green? Spring. And where do we go to Cape Ansport?
now because it's
It's summer.
and then you're going
I was shocked by the death of Zim and knew. I'd met Zim with Justice Douglas many years ago. He was an extraordinary character. While he became increasingly difficult in the last months, nevertheless, over a 10-year period, he'd held his country together, maintained its independence under very adverse conditions. The way he was killed made it particularly abhorrent. The question now is whether the generals can stay together and build a stable government, or whether Saigon will turn on public opinion in Saigon, the intellectuals, students, etc., will turn on this government as repressive and undemocratic in the not-too-distant future.
And as we know, that war was a complete disaster. Matter of fact, you're interviewing Oliver Stone, as you referenced before, partially because Stone was a combat veteran in Vietnam, in a war which was a disaster in which millions of Vietnamese were killed. 58,000 Americans lost their lives. The United States itself, arguably, has never recovered from Vietnam and now loses per year, just in terms of opioid addictions, the same number of people that we lost in Vietnam in the course of a total of a 10-year official war and more like a 20-year engagement. So you have a situation in which that disaster, which was something that Kennedy admits there that he was part of, and of course he was attempting to pull out of Vietnam, but this was a process that had not happened. And even the seeming to let Henry Cabot Lodge, who was an opponent of Kennedy, political opponent of his, get the whiff in his mind that he could change the government as he wished by assassinating its leadership. That should call to mind the situation that you have presently in Ukraine, where we installed the government that's in Ukraine now. We installed it in 2014. It was done by Victoria Nuland, who's still playing a leading role there in that circumstance. We have a situation where Seymour Hersh has demonstrated that the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up by the United States as an operation, not by Ukraine. Ukraine was part of it, of course, but they didn't do it. And that's what's being said now. It's like the third round of cover-up stories we have about that. Once again, they're being said the Ukrainians blew up Nord Stream pipeline. No, they did not. It's done by London and by the United States. As with the question of the Kharkova Dam, same kind of a situation. We're saying, well, the Ukrainian resistance did it. No, this is actually being done where we're actually at war. We're not admitting it. We're not saying it. So with the Kharkova Dam business, it's still a big lie that's out there. And if Americans don't stand up, at least in the way that some Americans attempted to stand up in the Vietnam War era now, then there's no way that you can keep the country going. There's no way to keep for justice to be heard in America again. And that permeates, it pollutes things just as much as the smoke from Canada has polluted and permeated every fabric of life suddenly in much of the Northeast and Midwest. You don't know what the source is, you know that it's lethal, and you know that it affects you. And that's the same thing as what has happened with the problem of the source of our problems, which lies in the assassination of President John Kennedy, and then his brother, as well as Martin Luther King and Malcolm X along the way to that arc. So you have the November 22nd, 1963 to June 6th of 1968. And then in between that, you have February 20th, I believe, 65, and April 4th of 1968. Malcolm was assassinated in 65 and King in 68, 2 months before Robert Kennedy Jr. That bracket of assassinations in America transformed America. And you can never get back to the America of that prior period, or for that matter, to any America you would want to be part of. You'll never get back to it unless you can publicly acknowledge the nature of the crime of the assassination of that president. Now, the only way for us to really do that, the only positive way to do it, is to take something like this speech at American University and celebrate what it shows us, or that speech at the UN and celebrate what that shows us, that that was what had happened, that Kennedy had gone in that direction. He had a problem with the CIA. He had a problem with Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, who had been fired by Kennedy. But he didn't live to solve those problems. Probably that apparatus, along with other elements, were part of his assassination. Certainly, that's something that has been asserted by Robert Kennedy Jr. and has been asserted in other ways. Tucker Carlson, of course, after having back last November played a certain role in getting that story to come to light in a way that was critical both of Biden and Donald Trump, found himself bounced out of his situation there, his position, his anchor position. So this is a time for all good men and women to come to the aid of their nation and to follow what John Kennedy said. Ask what you can do for your country and then do it. And I think that's really the meaning of this speech. And I think it's the meaning of the occasion of this Saturday and the subsequent days, I would say leading into the 4th of July.
Well, Dennis, I want to thank you again for coming on the show.
Great. Happy to have come on.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I just want to thank you again for coming on the show. I think that's a great place to stop. I think that definitely gives people just a very taste of what they'll be getting, because you'll be expanding more on this and other people will be talking more about this on Saturday. Is that right?
Yeah, what will happen is I'll be moderating, as you're going to have a whole set of speakers. Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, will be with us. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who's the head of the Schiller Institute, will be starting us off. And there'll be people from Guyana, from Asia, from Africa, other parts of the world, who will be giving reflections on what they think about the character and the importance of the speech. Also some messages that we'll be getting from some people. And it's supposed to be like a symposium. That's what it is. Not not as formal as some other things we've done. Yeah, there's going to be some people that'll be speaking at the beginning, but then we're going to open up for answering various questions and have a dialogue among the people about it, and hopefully come up with some ideas about how to take the spirit of that speech and the eloquence of that speech and apply it to today.
Hey, everyone. Well, listen, thank you again for tuning in. That is June 10th. You can see it up on your screen, 10 a.m. Eastern time. It's an international. So as Dennis said, we're going to have people from different parts of the world coming on. You're not going to want to miss it. It's happening on the Schiller Institute platform. And Dennis Speed, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.